Okay, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I can't actually properly see you, but it's great to kind of see you here. Well, today I'm going to talk a little bit about cyber attribution, a couple of caveats at the start, but I wanted, this let's say, conversation, this session, really kind of like draws on a series of things and a series of spaces and places that I've been in the past decade. So in the past, let's say, 10 years, I've had the opportunity to be in rooms with government representatives in multiple regions, right? That includes from Santiago, Chile, New York, Brussels, Vienna, India, and so many other places. And one of the things that I always go into these conversations, be they multilateral conversations, where you get to observe how states interact with one another, there are two things that I usually think, and I ask myself when I go into these rooms. The first one is, how do these states, from their different cultural, geographic perspectives, from their particular standpoint, geopolitically speaking, how do they define what do they think as unacceptable behavior, right? And the second thing is, how do they communicate that? How do they make sure that they are signaling and that what they're signaling is coming across in the way that they actually think it is? And to start out this conversation about who gets to point fingers, right? Because it already assumes that some continuously point fingers to other states, and others maybe don't. And to do that, I'd like to take us back to 2019, and to start with a story. 2019, and let's go to Caracas, Venezuela. And not because of the current geopolitical context, although, the tensions were there back then. But in 2019, something really interesting happened. For 6 days, Venezuela was in total blackout, or at least almost total blackout. 18 of its 23 states were with no electricity, so no telecommunications, no nothing. As a result, 26 people died during those 6 days, reportedly. And some reported, that was linked to the Guri Dam, which is let's say, the dam that provides, back then, 80% of the energy for the whole of Venezuela. So we're in 2019, and then President Nicolas Maduro gave a statement where he said, this blackout is the result, a direct result, of the United States conducting a cyber sabotage campaign against us. And that is why it's totally blacked out. A few days later, and a few months later, obviously, experts and reporters and amongst others said that it wasn't necessarily an actual attribution, that the US hadn't actually conducted that cyber sabotage campaign, but what had happened was infrastructure decay. And this tells us the story of who gets to point fingers, but how to do so credibly, consistently, and also in alignment with international norms and commitments that states have made at the UN and elsewhere. And I think to tell the story, right, many states conduct cyber attribution for multiple purposes, and I should clarify that when I say cyber attribution here, I'm talking about cyber political public attribution, because obviously many of you here in the room might be doing, or if you're in a CTI, kind of in the CTI industry, you might be doing technical attribution. If you're in a national cert, you might be doing that if that's the function. If you're in a national cybersecurity agency, you might be doing that as well. So the thing here is, we don't want to repeat the Venezuela story if other states start to jump in and tell and point fingers, right? But I wanted to tell the story of, cyber attribution and who gets to point fingers in 4 acts, right, if we can put it that way. So, many of you might be very familiar with this. So start talking about this, obviously, one needs to ask the question of when did cyber attribution become a thing? And again, I'm talking about political, public cyber attribution. And actually, this whole story started in the private sector, right? Some people start telling the story by exactly talking about the Mandiant APT1 report, but others, you can't even go back as far to talk about the Operation Aurora blog post, right? With the blog post, the first blog post, they didn't necessarily say which, let's say, unit of the PLA was behind it, or didn't kind of like properly name who was behind it, but they said it was, the activity was coming from China. And then obviously Mandiant did kind of name, it was a different case, but obviously it was talking about like the specific PLA units conducting cyber espionage campaigns. And of course, this story started out like in the private sector, but the context back then was quite interesting because you saw that, the Mandiant report was 2014, if I'm not mistaken, and then right after that, we had the US kind of publishing its first indictments against, and naming actually 4 PLA hackers. And that was kind of like a shift, right? Because usually governments really struggled. Back then, it was like, we don't want to tell this story. We don't want to actually attribute. We don't want to publicly attribute. I would rather, as an MFA, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or State Department, I would rather just go to the Chinese embassy and just say, what's going on? Can we have a conversation? And you could probably have a démarche. You could still do sanctions, but still how do you know how much to disclose? And obviously the Mandiant kind of report kind of gave that opportunity, or at least, created the window of opportunity, along with as we know, the OPM hack that came, and then we had the Obama-Xi agreements in 2015. So all of that was an interesting context for this public disclosure of information to start to shape the public debate of what is credible, acceptable, and consistent attribution. And of course, what is the objective of cyber attribution, for governments when they're doing this through their, let's say, ministries of foreign affairs? It is to name and shame. It is to create some form of deterrent, right? Obviously, you might say, well, Louise, just naming and shaming isn't necessarily creating a deterrent effect to your adversary. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. But it is one tool of the toolbox. So hang there with me. I also have that kind of slight skepticism. But it shouldn't be seen in an isolated manner. So now that was 2015. If we now go 10 years later to where we're at right now, it's interesting to see how what started with the private sector, then there was this window of opportunity in the US, started to become a consistent practice. Obviously, the UK conducted its first public cyber attribution in 2017, then the Netherlands followed, and then others followed, and how that went. But some others held back, and that's the case, for example, of France, which only solely publicly attributed earlier this year in April, and that's the report that you see there from ONC. That doesn't mean that the National Cybersecurity Agency didn't support or acknowledge other, let's say, attributions, but they hadn't actually named a state as linked to a particular APT. And that is the same case with Switzerland. Switzerland hasn't necessarily fully named, but they have been testing the waters by getting closer and closer to a full public attribution, which is then linking a state to a particular, articulating the whole thing of linking a state to a particular APT and imposing measures. Another thing, it's interesting because in the past years, I don't know how many of you have been following and tracking those attributions, which at the end of the day, the collation of these attributions, they are supposed to have the effect of establishing what is unacceptable behavior, of signaling to these adversaries beyond, let's say, other tools, which might even include offensive cyber operations, that this is not okay. and to have some kind of reputational damage to those that actually care about their reputation internationally, and you can read between the lines of that. But what we see is obviously that the making of public attribution as a thing has become quite consistent, and you have now statements from NATO in support of some of the collective attributions. Think of Czechia and Germany earlier this year doing it together, and then NATO also supporting that, and you have the EU also supporting other attributions, which is quite significant when we think of the European narrative and response, along with, let's say, the transatlantic kind of partners and other allies. One thing that's interesting that I imagine some of you have been observing is that not only it has become a thing in the sense of part of a statecraft kind of toolbox, but it also has become something that it's starting to shift according to the particular threat actor. So the GRU campaign, which the UK government published a profile on the GRU activities, it's kind of like testing the waters on how to attribute, but also kind of do it in a more hybrid fashion, how to integrate those narratives of, let's say, the poisonings with also malicious cyber activities and naming some of the units, so doing it all at once as a big bundle. So that is interesting to see more and more. So as I said, what we've observed in the past few years is this cross-regional expansion of attribution. We see that testing and calibrating to include the hybrid element, testing in the sense of, can I go as far as to name the APT and then I go to full attribution? Or can I partner with others, as Czechia has done previously with Germany, and then Czechia going and doing its own public attribution, right? It's states feeling more and more comfortable and testing what is acceptable from their side in terms of communicating those red lines. And it's not by chance. I'm here talking about like how states have been consistently crafting, and mostly Western governments, right, that have been doing this. But there's a reason for them to do that as well. There is a process. Since the 1990s, the UN has had a process which is, firstly, it was the group of governmental experts, then it was the open-ended working group, which is a mouthful for first the small group, then the 193 states coming together to discuss what are the rules of the road, right? I mean, what is acceptable behavior? And they came up in 2015, interestingly enough, 2015, with what I would say, it's like their 11 commandments. Maybe not that big, but thou shalt not target and attack another country's cert. Thou shalt not target another country's infrastructure. And then when we look at those, we might be like, well, who's actually tracking, who's observing which norms, right? And those are voluntary norms. But states have also agreed that international law applies to cyberspace. So there is this benchmark of understanding of what is acceptable or not. So in attributing, many states do refer back to the norms and how some states have not been observing those norms consistently. So as I said, again, this is public political cyber attribution. And why, again, do states want to name and shame? I think from a technical perspective, obviously, it's like, well, I mean, we need proper evidence. We need to make sure that there is a high evidentiary threshold. We need to make sure that internally in our intelligence agencies, but also in our, let's say, equivalent of, let's say, our National Cybersecurity Agency, there should be an understanding of what is the acceptable level of disclosure that we want to have, and that is usually what stops some states from actually doing public attribution, because you're going to disrupt, you're going to expose the adversary, and then you're going to dismantle their operation because they're going to regroup and then kind of do their thing elsewhere. But states do think that there is a value in positioning themselves diplomatically, and especially Western governments. There is an element of domestic accountability, right? Taxpayer money going into these national cybersecurity agencies, right, and centers. So how do you make sure to your population that you're saying, like, we are responding to that? So, for example, when Germany's kind of Social Democratic Party was targeted, that was one of the main reasons for them to attribute it, was also like, well, we need to respond. This is part of our, like, one of our parties has been hit, and we can't leave this unsaid. So we need to name names, we need to point fingers. And of course, for those that matter, reputational costs. You might argue that Russia, if you attribute something to, like, the GRU, they couldn't care less, probably, from a state-to-state perspective. But if you think of China back in 2015, right, when the Obama-Xi agreement was signed, that was a really important moment, because for them, it was the first time that, indictments were done and that 5 hackers had been named. And remember also that that was the start of the Xi presidency, and that was a whole new moment for China. And having them be exposed in that way back then wasn't great for saving face, right? So you see that for some states, it really does matter when it comes to, like, reputational damage. And of course, the whole point, if you speak to any of these government representatives that are working cross-government to do public cyber attribution, they'll say to you, we need to work collectively and do it jointly to make sure that we are creating almost like a consensus of what's unacceptable, in addition to the norms, because the norms themselves, they are, as strong as, like, how much you refer to them, basically. And of course, as I said, there are a couple of assumptions there: that you have technical capacity, that you do the intelligence coordination, that you adhere to international frameworks, and that you can manage and counter some of the challenges that emerge throughout the process. Now, this is where it gets interesting, right? Because I said that most of these attributions have been conducted by your usual suspects. That is no longer the case. And I guess, again, going back to the Venezuela story, when we think about, let's say, global South countries conducting cyber attribution, I think the first thing that might come to mind is, like, where's the capacity to actually have the evidentiary standards for you to properly and consistently do this, right? And then the Venezuela case comes to mind as, like, oh, maybe not. Maybe this is not the way of going. And you see states just using it as a narrative tool rather than an actual tool for, let's say, deterring, imposing costs, and working with other tools to degrade, disrupt, and deny the adversaries from having, let's say, strategic advantage in cyberspace. But as many of you might have seen, in the past few years, China has become quite vocal. And China, it's quite interesting because both, like, in the attribution game, but also if you went to, like, these multilateral settings at the UN, these negotiations on responsible state behavior, they would be very quiet there. And they usually wouldn't do attribution, right? They would just continue doing their own thing. But that changed in the past few years. There are at least 3 phases, and this is the report of the Harbin Winter Games. It's one of the reports that they have published this year attributing to the US. But the first phase, let's say, of China testing cyber attribution, obviously it started in the private sector with some of their key cybersecurity companies kind of publishing reports. Then what we had was, like, government and private companies, but then the government taking more of, like, a strategic role. And mostly, like, MFA statements around this, referring to those reports. But then phase 3, so phase 1 was 2019 to 2022. Phase 2 was 2022-ish. And then from 2022 onwards, what you see is, like, parts of the government, such as the computer virus emergency response team, then starting to publish their own reports. Interestingly enough, publishing it in English and publishing it almost like as a counter-narrative to existing accusations against China. The first report that the CVERC published in 2024 was a direct reaction to the Volt Typhoon attribution, and the whole report is just a counter-narrative to, it has very little technical detail, and it is a counter-narrative to the US's attribution, and amongst others, right, because it was a major kind of joint attribution back then. And they said that Volt Typhoon isn't actually like a Chinese, like, activity. It is mostly like criminal groups and ransomware groups operating, and then they kind of try to articulate that narrative. Similar thing with the Harbin Winter Games. It was earlier this year. They published this report. Again, it was the CVERC. And this report, again, a report in English, so you can see what's the target audience of naming and shaming and pointing fingers to the US, saying, amongst other things, referring to when they targeted, another attribution that the Chinese made, the Northwestern Technical University. And now finally, and that report was also not, and speaking to technical folks, speaking to CTI researchers, and kind of trying to understand the logic beyond the counter-narrative, the technical bits really didn't hold up. But Operation Futile, which is a very interesting kind of title, it is a more technical report. So you see that even in a context of like a year, when we think of other states, and in this case China, like changing their way of attributing, what we do see is that they don't have a problem with like testing out things and looking a bit like they're just doing kind of a counter disinfo or disinfo ops, or having their narrative, or as some have mentioned, like a propaganda of their own, let's say, attribution. They have tested it out. They might have looked like they don't have the right technical standards, but this last one was a bit more sophisticated. And in the Harbin Winter Games, I forgot to mention, they also, for the first time, named three folks that worked at the NSA as part of that attribution, which is unprecedented. And we know how quickly they adapt, so I wouldn't be surprised in a few years' time, or less than that, that they changed their legislative system to actually have like things such as indictments, right? So you see that they're testing out their public communications around this, and there's a very clear English-speaking audience to that. But it's easy to talk about who gets to point fingers if we're talking about he said, she said in a US-China context. What happens when we look at other states? What happens when we start to try to understand how attribution looks like? What does it mean? Again, it is important because states can refer to what is acceptable or not. They create understandings of what is acceptable or not, and they can refer back to that both at the diplomatic level, but they can also justify then conducting certain campaigns. So all of this is interlinked. And in the past few years, I've been dedicating quite a lot of time to kind of speaking to some of these governments, conducting interviews, going to different parts of the world, speaking to them and asking the question of how do you then signal? I told you, what are the two questions, right, that I ask every time I'm in a room? So I got the chance of consistently asking that. And one of the things that we understood from this research is that many of these developing countries or global south countries, they might look at attribution and say, well, we might even have the capacity, but we would rather just condemn the behavior rather than actually name the state. And, well, interestingly enough, Singapore, which is a city-state, which has a big Chinese population, or a Chinese, origin kind of like population, decided to partially attribute, you could say, earlier this year in July. So they said, and that was at the 10th anniversary of the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore. And in that moment, the Minister for Home Affairs said, well, we've observed that there is the presence of an APT group, UNC 3886. And I mean, for those of you, probably most of you know, that this is associated with China. But it is interesting because Singapore is playing a very, very good game here. They aren't naming China explicitly. You can read between the lines because, UNC 3886 is associated, but it is an UNC, so it is an unclassified cluster. So there you go. They keep some level of ambiguity. They still name and shame to some degree because for a Singaporean perspective, for Southeast Asian countries, they won't necessarily have a culture of confronting another state in a very explicit manner. That doesn't mean that they don't have the processes and the frameworks to do so, but it's just that from a cultural standpoint, cyber attribution for many of them is something that this might be as far as they go. Does that mean that it's less effective? Possibly not, precisely because of that cultural background. Precisely not because the timing was also quite important. Remember that I mentioned the UN process? Singapore was the chair of the United Nations Open-Ended Working Group between 2021 and 2025. Now guess when did that process end? In July. And when did the Home Affairs Minister go and actually delivered that speech? End of July. So they were just waiting for them to not be in a position where they had to be like an impartial mediator of a 5-year process to determine the rules of the world of cyberspace, to then go and have their own say about it. But it's not just Singapore, because you could argue, well, Singapore is a very specific, particular country, highly digitized. Their cybersecurity agency has been there for 10 years, and it's quite impressive to see what they have been doing, right? At the diplomatic and also at like the technical level, they do have a very important presence. But what happens when Samoa ends up calling out APT 40, when they publish not only a technical advisory, but they keep on saying that narrative? That opens up another box of questions, which is, why would Samoa do it? And wouldn't they be fearful, as many other states do argue, that fear of retaliation, right? If you name and shame, obviously there will be some form of retaliation, be it in a cyber context or be it in trade, right? And that could very much happen. But it's interesting because Australia has been supporting Samoa and many other Pacific Island states in building their capacities, their computer emergency response teams and SOC and many, many other things, and even developing rapid response mechanisms for countries in the region. But that also points to another trend, which I think it's the one that I really wanted to leave us all thinking about. Is cyber attribution just a Western game or just for the big players, right? What happens when we start to see these examples? And what is our expectation in terms of what are the evidentiary thresholds for that to be credible, consistent, and accountable? Obviously, these states, they want to signal and they want to be part of this conversation, and obviously they might even have the information, and which sometimes they can't share, sometimes they have received it from elsewhere. But this is purely speculation, especially with the case of Samoa, which I think there has been less of a reporting kind of attention to that one. So it is important for us to look at these cases, because if we are to talk about how technical attribution connects to political public attribution, the decision-making process within a government or across government to do that, and government doing that, not just the usual suspects, but let's say global South countries also joining this party, we really need to assess those with more care. Because even if they're not doing it in the same manner, because of the culture and geopolitical context, they might do it differently, but they might have the effect of still delineating those red lines, which is particularly important. And for a country like, as the UK, one of the things that if you look at some of the public documents, your national cybersecurity strategy, there's a national action plan coming soon, but the national cybersecurity strategy, you'll see that there is this recognition that these middle ground states need to be more understood. Otherwise, this will be, just a conversation between two very specific groups of folks, and the norms that were agreed amongst the 193 countries won't actually take place because, why should one care, right? If in a group of 193 states, as I've been in that room with all of those states, only a few are actually kind of getting the ball rolling or talking about how to make this more enforceable. So what now, right? What now? So there are a few questions that I'd like to leave you today with, and one of the ones that I keep going back is, what is a more vocal China in doing like attribution signal to other global South countries? Will they be encouraged to do it? In which ways, right? Will they want to do it with like less evidence and more narrative? Will they want to test out things and not be that concerned about what are the repercussions? I think this is important for us to think about within, let's say, this broader geopolitical competition landscape. Obviously, things remain with regards to reconciling intelligence sharing and the appetite for defining like irresponsible behavior. And obviously, they will also favor technical capacity and developing that over actually attributing. But this is one of the things that we are trying to do at RUSI and as part of the global partnership. So I know that Jeff did mention that the global partnership, it is a network of over 80 researchers from across different regions trying to understand exactly that, not just, let's say, the technical and political attribution, but also looking at like, how do states define like what they see as like responsible or irresponsible behavior domestically, operationally? Let's say like, how do they justify developing cyber or offensive cyber capabilities? But also looking at attribution. And in this context, we are launching a Global South Cyber Attribution Task Force to precisely build a database. And database might be a bit of ambitious word, or let's say, because there are a few cases, but we need to study them more clearly if we want to make sure that there is international accountability, that those states that are conducting malicious cyber activity, they can receive a response that's from a broader range of governments rather than your usual suspects, right? We need to take this conversation forward and further, and we need to start by doing that and assessing in which ways have these governments have already communicated. These governments from the Global South have done that. So we want to provide recommendations and map those South-South and South-North attributions. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. And if you are working on this, if you're mapping cases such as these, if you are interested, please do reach out, and I'd love to have a conversation with you. Thank you.